Shalom everyone, welcome to our ongoing classes in our series entitled How to Live a Godly Life, Legends and Tales from the Mystical Talmud. We are learning tonight in the story from the tractate Gitin, a very famous legend which, as we discussed last week, the source of so many legends and tales that permeated both Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam. Many legends that are propounded throughout all of the Western and some even the Eastern world, even the occult. This is a story found in, as I said, the tractate Gitin, in our English version of the Legends of the Talmud by Rabbi Finkel. This story started on page 432. We read through 433, and today we're going to continue the story on 434. Solomon, King Solomon, and Ashmedai, the king of the demons. In our introduction last week, I spoke to you about some of the traditional commentaries of how this story is interpreted. And as I was preparing tonight's lesson, and did, of course, further reviews in more commentaries, I found something rather amusing. A point that I have discussed in many of our previous lessons, and indeed in the introduction to this series. I placed very strong emphasis on the introduction to the Talmudic legends written by none less than Rabbi Abraham, the son of Maimonides. And how he wrote back in, the 1300s, 1200s or so, that any Talmudic story which seems to go beyond the pale of reality is to be understood as a metaphor, symbolically, and never at all to be taken literally. Now, when we dealt with certain issues like the stories of Alexander the Great, we indeed had to address matters of that nature. But a point that I've emphasized to you since we began these lessons is the sages who tell these stories codified here in the Talmudic tales aren't out to be storytellers. They're not Hans Jewish Andersen out to make you go ooh and ah about a long tale that begins with words once upon a time. Rather, they're out to tell us an ethical, moral lesson. And even in the most symbolic and abstract and metaphorical teachings, to put within them teachings, sometimes even secrets, about real things that are literally put into story form so that we can extract from them actual lessons. And one of these things is indeed an understanding of demonology. As we've discussed in our previous class, there are real demons. The Talmud speaks about this in great detail. The mystics have spoken about this in great detail. The concept of demonic existence is nothing new to Judaism. It's certainly not of any rabbinic origin. We find it going back, the word that we call demons, shedim, we even find in the Torah itself. And as we began this discussion on King Solomon, when it says that he had captured shedim and shedot, that it's been interpreted that he understood that, the rabbis understood that as capturing the demonic entities, of course, and that's why we're learning this story right now. Now, the point of this story is, like Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam would have said, I don't think this is necessarily an historical event, and that this is actually a recording of factual events as they occurred. And in that respect, We could look at Rabbi Abraham's position that this is symbolical, metaphorical, nod our head in agreement. But yet, I tell you, like many of the other commentators state, there are still deeper lessons herein. And you will find other Talmudic commentaries that recognize the elements that are concealed within a story like this and extract them for us to learn. One of the great commentaries was written by a Rabbi Yosef Hayim, who is famous for his halachic, his legal law code called the Ben Ish Hai. He was from Baghdad about, give or take 110, 120 years ago. And he understood the true nature and element of this story. And as I said, what I found amusing was that modern day commentaries written from the Eastern European rationalist point of view go to great lengths to say, don't listen to this story. It's all a bunch of symbolism, like Rabbi Abraham, the son of Maimonides, says. There's no such thing as demons. It's all symbolic. It's make-believe. And I smile. And I say, boy, these people go out on a limb, number one, to contradict all the Talmudic commentaries that are written before them. To contradict the very fundamental teachings of our sages, dating back from the Bible itself, from pseudepigraphal literature, original Agadic and Midrashic literature, Talmudic literature, Qumranic Essenic literature, mystical literature. These so-called modern black hatters literally take an entire 2,500, if not 3,000-year-old tradition of Judaism, crumble it up and throw it into the garbage because it doesn't meet their philosophical outlook of the world. And these people proclaim themselves to be the true redactors of Torah Judaism. Boy, if that is not a cult-like proclamation, I don't know what is. But with that being said, we're going to review now the rest of the story. And as I said, don't look to this in any historical light, but let's extract from it what we're meant to learn from it. And then I'm going to take you into other sources. I'm going to take you into Rabbi Yosef Hayim and his commentary to this section, in which he addresses the issues of demons, curiously, from the point of law, Jewish law. And now we just finished a series in the laws of the occult. And in lesson 5, we did address issues of demonic entities and forbidden and permitted interactions with them. Because as we've been learning from this story, there certainly seems to be some permissibility of exposure for reasons that could contribute to the service of God. And as we see, of course, that was Solomon's motivations. But as a point made that we discussed in our last class, if and when we decide to play with fire, don't be surprised that you end up being burned. And as we're going to learn, this was the case with King Solomon as well. And then I want to conclude this lesson by taking you to another section of the Talmud, which surprisingly, Rabbi Finkel did not seem to translate at all. It's left out. And this is a section from Tractate Berakhot, in which we're going to learn from the teachings of a certain Abba Benyamin and other rabbis who tell us old Talmudic understandings and insights of how to recognize a demonic presence right out of the Talmud. Now, I've seen online all types of attacks on the Talmud, of course, on Jews and Judaism as well, and all these things that they call nonsense and blasphemy. Unfortunately, these authors who write these things have, of course, their own racist and hate-filled agendas. But aside from all of that, the level of legitimacy that's lacking from them is based upon the fact that they just really don't understand the milieu, the sociology of what they're looking at. They look at words and they say, aha, this means this to me. And they respond accordingly. To which we have to respond, well, you want to know something? You can't look at things in the light of how you wish to interpret them and think that that's what it means. Because ultimately, that's not necessarily true. And I always give the following example. If we were to be speaking to someone who, let's just say, for example, English is not their mother tongue, and they were to ask you in whatever accent they speak, how are you? And you would respectfully respond, as we do in English, in our common vernacular, and say, I'm cool. I'm cool. A person not understanding English vernacular, because it's not the native tongue, might interpret the concept cool, if he understood the word, to mean that you are chilly or cold, and that you are making a statement about the temperature or the environment or how you're physically feeling. He would not understand the construct of the term cool in the vernacular to mean I am fine, I am okay, I'm relaxed, I'm comfortable, etc. And that fundamental misunderstanding could therefore skewer this person's entire concept of the conversation, of you as an individual, and of many other misunderstandings. This is always a problem. And nowhere is this problem more found than understanding the Bible. People look at the Bible all the time in English and think, well, gee, the Bible is in English. It speaks about our days and our times and our ways and our thoughts. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. We're talking about a set of books, literature, that were written using Star Wars terms in almost a galaxy a long, long time ago in a place far, far away. Over 3,000 years old. In a culture so far removed from us psychologically, sociologically, anthropologically, that we really don't understand. And that's why if you don't put a thing in a context, you lose it. Understand now last week's lesson and the conclusion of this week's in this context that I am presenting for you. Or otherwise, you're not going to understand what our sages are talking about and what they're trying to relate. Again, they're not here to talk history, but they are here to teach us other lessons. So on page 434 in our Ein Yaakov, tractate Gitin, we're in the middle of the story in which King Solomon called upon the head of his bodyguard, Ben Yehoyada, to go into the other world and capture Ashmedai, the king of the demons, who, according to an opinion and a view, he's actually considered to be a good demon. One who fears God, who wishes to serve God, which is why he never breaks the chain with God's name on it off of him. And he comes to serve King Solomon. Now, in other stories or legends about Ashmedai, which we find most likely from older sources, in books like the Apocrypha, and a very famous story called the Book of Tobiah in Hebrew, Ashmedai is portrayed as being a real bad guy. And then you have other material from the time. We discussed this last week. A very famous pseudepigraphal work, which you could find on the internet, called the Testament of Solomon, which is another set of stories about Solomon and his control of the demons. And so, Solomon, control of demons, Jews and Judaism, control of demons. This is how in the Christian and sometimes in Islamic mindset, the two are put together. And of course, they try to conclude from that correlation all kinds of negative and evil things about the Jewish people, which leads them to violence and hatred and racism and all kinds of terrible things. All because, again, they're violating our fundamental rule of not understanding what on earth it is that they're being told. King Solomon had King Ashmedai subdued so that he can extract from him a specific strange item called the Shamir. The Shamir was said to be some kind of a little worm that you would place on a rock and it would cut it in half. And as we've learned in our last lesson, Solomon needed this because the stones needed to form the holy temple could not be hammered and chiseled. So they had to be cut in some other way. And many people have interpreted today this Shamir to possibly been the secret of laser or light technology. And only an other entity would have access to these technologies. And it is interesting that when we speak of these demonic races, a point that Rabbi Chaim Vital made very clearly in what we discussed last week, that there are different types and species. And that indeed, they can appear to be completely physical in every which way, but, as we will see. And this is very important, because even to this day, people have close encounters of a demonic kind, and they're not even aware of the nature of that which is in their presence. And that's a big problem. When we read a lot of this UFO alien abduction literature, and we put the stories side by side with old demonic abduction literature, you know, like the old saying goes, if it smells like a rose and looks like a rose and all the rest, and I guess it still is. Well, in my ebook on Torah and UFOs and aliens in light of Torah, I should say, I discussed all of this material. And I put it side by side there. And we spoke of last week the Nishaya and all the rest of that stuff. So I recommend you back there. But now, Ashmedai has made it to King Solomon. As we saw from his travels with Ben Yahu, Ashmedai was very helpful, he was very wise, and he seemed to know what was going on. So now, King Solomon has the Shamir, but he did not release Ashmedai from his service until the building of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, was complete. Now one day, King Solomon was alone with Ashmedai, who again, mind you, has this chain with the holy name on it and has the full appearance of a human being. And Solomon asks him, you know, it says, quoting Numbers 24, verse 8, that God has To'afot and Re'im to carry out his missions. And he says, well, we interpret To'afot to be referring to ministering angels, and these Re'im to be referred to demons. And he said, I can understand that, you know, these angels, they're different from people. But in what sense are you demons superior to us humans? We're under the impression, and we corrected this in our last class, that demons are fallen angels. And there is one reference where that is made, but that is usually not the accepted. And there's a big issue here. You know what? I'll digress for just a second to discuss it. We're all familiar with the sons of God who came down and took the daughters of Ben, Genesis 6. I discussed with you how, according to many older opinions, they were actually flesh and blood humanoid people who came down. And it is said that their cohabitations led to a race of whom we call demons. Well, it is also taught that there was a reptilian pre-Adamic race represented by the original serpent in the Garden of Eden, who, according to ancient legends, stood erect like a man and was humanoid in every which way. We know it spoke, supposedly had arms and legs and everything else. And according to the old mystical legend, this serpent copulated with Eve, creating a mixed species entity. And it was from here that came forth what we call the demonic race. That a reptilian race and a humanoid race commingled, and their DNA came out to form this other race. Which means that they're mostly human in every which way, with some exceptions that we're going to learn in a minute. King Solomon now turns to Ashmedai and says, okay, how are you guys superior to us humans? Now, in the light of what I've just shared with you, we might already have the answer. But Ashmedai is not there to give King Solomon a history lesson or a lesson on alien anatomy or physiology. Of course, like everything else in Talmudic lore, we're here to learn moral lessons. And therefore, the remainder of the story is to teach us just that. So Ashmedai says to King Solomon, all right, I'll tell you what, take this chain that has God's name engraved on it off of me, give me your ring, and I'll just show you how superior we are to you humans. Now, we already know, if you remember, I quoted to you from an ancient commentary called the Avot, the Rabbi Natan, that Shedim are like humans in three ways: that they eat and drink, sexually procreate, and die. And yet, like angels, they can fly around in the air, they can appear invisible, and have insight into the immediate future about 30 days out. Now we consider that an advantage over human beings. The Avot, the Rabbi Natan teachings could have been inserted here, but that is not what the moral point is all about. Now, again, remember, don't look at this story as a historical rendition. Let's go with the flow. So, King Solomon removes the chain and gives Ashmedai the ring. Apparently, there was trust between them. Ashmedai swallows the ring, and placing one wing on the earth and one into the sky, he throws Solomon 400 miles. And Solomon had this incident in mind when he said, quoting here Ecclesiastes 1 verse 3, "What profit does man have for all his labor when he toils beneath the sun? And this was my reward for all my endeavors." Ecclesiastes 2:10. Now what is this that he's saying to "this is my reward" refer to? So Rabbi Shmuel offered different opinions. One said that it meant that all that he had left in the world, King Solomon, was the staff in his hand. The other said no, it meant the apron that he was wearing. In other words, he had to go from door to door begging. He had nothing left. Most richest man in the world. And whenever he would go, he would say, "I am Kohelet, the king over Israel and Jerusalem." And so the story goes that he had to come and walk back to Israel. And that when he came to the Sanhedrin, claiming to be King Solomon, the rabbis said, well, one second here. You should know that the Sanhedrin is clearly, historically, a governing body, a legislative body, clearly of late Second Temple antiquity. It did not exist in that form in the days of the First Temple. There was no historic Sanhedrin in the days of King Solomon or Moses or anyone of the kind. Granted, there were elders of the people, but they did not form this specific legislative body in the structure that had existed in the Second Temple period. So therefore, our reference to the Sanhedrin in the days of Solomon, of course, is midrashic. It's meant to teach a story. Being that these stories are written hundreds of years after the fact, it's meant to refer to a reality which the people understood. Isn't that what all stories, or how all stories are told? So let's not trip over an historical anomaly. So, the rabbis say, "Oh, you're King Solomon." Well, let's see. They said a person who is insane does not repeat the same absurdity over and over again. Rather, he's going to have a number of different delusions. So, what's the meaning of this? They were curious. Here's a guy who's claiming over and over again he's really King Solomon, but Ashmedai had taken King Solomon's appearance, and he had taken over the kingdom in the name of, and the vision of, and the image of King Solomon. And here you got some guy out there saying, "I'm the king, not him." Sounds like one of these plots from one of these movies that we might see. How do you know? What do you do? Okay. So they asked. First, they go to Ben Yahu. who was the one who originally captured him. And he said, look, does the king summon you lately? Are you guys, talking? And Benyahu replied, no, I haven't seen him and doesn't talk to him. And then they asked the queens. Remember, King Solomon had a bevy of babes. And they said, does the king come to you these days? Obviously, it wasn't for just a visit. The implication was for conjugal relations. And they replied, yeah, he does come. So then the Sanhedrin are suspicious, and they sent a message to the queens. Examine his feet, because the feet of a shed, a demon, resemble the feet of a rooster. Now here is one of these interesting little teachings, because it was understood that when you had a demonic presence whose form could be perceived, that somehow, even though they looked humanoid in all which ways, their feet were somewhat different. No, they weren't big and hairy like those of the Hobbit in The Lord of the Rings, but rather rooster-like, claw-like. Others have said, rather than like a rooster, maybe reptilian-like. An indication of that hybridization that we had mentioned earlier. So, the wives then answer and says, well, he's wearing shoes. It says here slippers. And he comes and he also visits his mom Bathsheba. So, now they're curious because they would be able to recognize an entity, even as physical as it appeared, by the nature of its feet. Rabbi Yosef Hayim, in his commentary to this Talmudic section, goes and offers a very interesting mystical understanding of what this is all about. It's outside of our moral and homiletic meaning, so I'm not going to get into it. But back to our story. It says that then the rabbis brought the real Solomon, gave him the ring on which God's name was engraved, which somehow was retrieved, and they don't say how, so again, it's a story, so we don't have to worry about it. And when Solomon came to the palace, Ashmedai saw him and flew away. And that was the end of him. Now, here's an interesting little tidbit before we conclude this section here. It says here in the Talmud that Ashmedai the demon was sexually intimate with all of Solomon's wives. Sexual encounters with Shindalits appears to be a very common theme. We find this in cultures around the world. Many of you might be familiar with even fairy tales, the likes of which either the young prince or the young princess goes out into the woods and finds the beautiful or handsome member of the opposite sex. It's usually the young princess. She goes out and sees the beautiful, handsome woodsman. And he says, please, release me, or kiss me. I'm a frog, but I'm really a prince. And she kisses him. The prince, of course, turns human and says, I have my father's kingdom. I am the son of this great king. Come with me to my father's kingdom. And a chariot appears, usually made out of a pumpkin, if you know what I'm getting at. And then off they go. And then years later, somebody goes looking for the princess. Turns out she was kidnapped by the prince of demons, and now she is his wife, and she has born to him 10 children, etc., and so on. And sometimes the story is reversed, and it's the man who goes out and meets the beautiful princess who takes him to the underground layers, etc. And the underground relationship we've discussed in our previous lesson. All of these stories, fairy tales, are based and built upon these common denominators. If you look at these alien alleged encounters today, these alien abductions, the one thing you find common through all of them is a sexual component. Apparently, all these aliens are horny. All they want to do is get it on. Kind of got to scratch your head and says, what the? is that all about? Right? Now, I'm not one for, saying that I know anything about alien races or anything else of the kind, but if I was to go to another planet and find another alien race, what makes you think that you're going to find the members of their opposite sex so attractive that you're going to want to, procreate? Doesn't sound right. But yet, needless to say, as we've learned, something was there. We find in literature as late as the mid-1900s, in Rabbi Yehuda Fatiyah, in his book Minhat Yehuda, The Spirits Speak, available now in English, of stories in which, there was one story I remember reading about a woman in old Baghdad who claimed that a male demon would come to her and rape her on a regular basis. And apparently, King Solomon's wives have now all been defiled by this entity. And like I said to you earlier, Rabbi Yosef Hayim, in his commentary to this section of the Talmud, asks the legal question. With regards to adultery, the law states that a woman who commits adultery is forbidden by law to remain married to her husband, and forbidden by law to have any more conjugal relations with him. That's a penalty and a punishment. So under the circumstances were King Solomon's wives defiled in rape or adultery? And what is the status of a woman who succumbs to a liaison with a demonic entity? Let's say even if it was willing. Under the circumstances, this is actually discussed. Rabbi Yosef Hayim doesn't originate the answer. He quotes from a rabbi from hundreds of years before him, who's quoting from other rabbis from hundreds of years before him, who pretty much argue the point back and forth and conclude like this. Being that these entities are not actually physical fundamentally, even though they can take the form, we do not consider them to be violators. And therefore, a woman who is subject to abuse by them is not considered guilty of adultery in any way or form. A man who would be seduced by them is considered guilty of wasting his seed. But that's about it. Now, for those of you who are listening live, I've noticed a couple of you have written here in text that the sound is cutting in and out. Remember I told you, we are on a satellite internet connection, and we have storm clouds around. So, we are recording. If you miss live, you'll hear the recording. So for those of you listening to the recording, you got the advantage. This is a very interesting and realistic discussion, because the rabbis took the nature of this type of sexual assault seriously. They didn't laugh and chuckle and said, "Oh, who believes that kind of nonsense? That's ridiculous." Oh, no. When Rabbi Yosef Hayim is quoting from numerous sources, he's dead serious. And that's something that we must understand, especially from what we're going to read in this next section of the Talmud from Tractate Berakhot. The rabbis were very well aware of these entities. And one of the terms they were referred to is mazikin, which means those who cause harm. Now remember, like it says that these entities eat and drink. What do they eat and drink? Like we've discussed in previous times, they are not eating pizza and peanut butter sandwiches. Rather, they are entities that eat what we would today call life force energy. So that's why if and when you were to put out flowers or food on a table, like we discussed in the laws of the occult, and for these entities they're not going to come and chow down on them. You're going to come back and see, bite marks. But rather, they're going to siphon off the psychic energy, leaving it almost like a vacuum, energyless. And that is what we call unclean or tameh. Now, I'm hearing some thunder rumblings in the back here, in the background here. I don't think it got picked up here in recording. So again, if whatever reason, weather causes us to be disconnected, this lecture will continue without missing a beat, and the recording will be available. So, just like we had the problem in our judges class in our last evening, so we might have it now. But so be it. Moving right along. These entities look at us as food, and that is a big problem. Now, there are many laws in Judaism that state don't leave food out overnight, don't leave liquids out overnight, or anything of the kind. It's based upon the concern that these entities would be attracted to it. For those of you who are interested, go into the laws of the occult, lesson 5. I discussed that in detail. But right here, it says that Ashmedai flew away, and then it says, in spite of all this, Solomon was still frightened of Ashmedai. And that's why there it says here that in Solomon's bed at night, it was encircled by 60 warriors of Israel, all trained in warfare, skilled in battle, each with sword on the thigh because of the terror in the night. Remember, alien abductions, they always come at night, or when you're asleep, or when you're in a trance. This verse from the book of Song of Songs, chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, are traditionally recited before going to bed. Hine mitato shel Shlomo, shishim govurim saviv la megiborei Yisrael, kulam achozeh herev, kulam melamdei milchama, pachad belelot. Now, it's recited every night as a way of trying to protect ourselves at night. It's the reason why we recite the Shema Yisrael prayers before we go to bed. So that as our physical bodies are open because of the change and shifting in consciousness called sleep, we don't want to have any entities, snooping around and trying to find some advantage. And that's how come many people have nightmares at night. All kinds of things that we do in regards to that. But anyway, to conclude this section here, Rav and Shmuel had differing opinions about King Solomon now after this episode. One said that Solomon was originally a great king, but after this episode with Ashmedai, he wasn't the same anymore. Compared to the glory of his earlier years, he was now like a commoner. But the other said that originally he was a great king, and that on his wanderings he was like a commoner, and when he returned he was like a great king once again. Now we all know in the end King Solomon's wives turned his heart away. Gee, it sounds like the story with mighty Samson that we discussed in our judges class. But King Solomon was a curious and an interesting human being. And this legend of his relationship with a demon has echoed through history in cultures far and wide. Again, you have books like the Key of Solomon, Clavis Salomonis, the Maftech Shlomo, which to this day says that the sign of the seal of King Solomon that was on the magic ring was 2 triangles inverted one on top of the other, that which we today call the Magen David, the sign and symbol of Judaism. That was originally a magical symbol and had absolutely nothing at all to do with Judaism. You can go back into ancient archaeology and go back into First Temple archaeology, Second Temple archaeology, and you're never going to find any reference to or sign of what's called today a Jewish star. There's nothing Jewish about it. The sign and symbol of Judaism has always been the 7-branched candelabra we call the menorah. That is clear from history. In ancient Jewish synagogues, you'll find many different symbols that were used and embraced at the time, including even an original swastika, before it was stolen and perverted by the Nazis. Who then embraced the symbol of the Jewish star? That was almost imposed upon Jews in Judaism by the Christian society in which they lived, to give the Jews their own symbol. How come they didn't give them the symbol of the menorah? Because Christian folklore was that Jews were always involved with the devil. And the symbol and sign of the magic, the seal of Solomon, was the Jewish star. So when they imposed that sign upon the Jewish people, it was supposed to be and intended to be a badge of shame and dishonor. Ooh, you guys are related to that. And as such, it's stuck, and here it is today considered to be the great sign. It has no historical antiquity whatsoever. But it is what it is. We've now concluded the section in Tractate Gitin. We've discussed about demons, their reality. And now I'm going to take you into Tractate Berakhot, page 6a. Now I'm going to read to you from the Art Scroll English version, because it's always easy to read. And we're just going to discuss what it says. You will find that these words here do not begin with once upon a time. It begins here with the word Tanya, which means a teaching, which is meant to teach us an actual reality. No further ado, let me read. In English, of course. It was taught in a Baraita that Abba Binyamin says, if the eye would be granted permission to see, no creature would be able to stand in face of the demons that surround us. And interestingly, the notes here in the Art Scroll Talmud take us to a book which is written by the chief rabbi of Amsterdam back in the 1700s, Rabbi Menashe Ben Israel, called Nishmat Hayim, section 3, chapters 12 and 13. Very interesting. And he addresses there the issues of the philosophical denial of demons, but concludes, oh no, they're real, and he goes and tells a whole bunch of stories. Same kind of stories that we read about today, hear about today, under the names and titles of alien abductions or possessions. So apparently, even though that Rabbi Ben Israel is writing this, 1,500 years after these words were written here from Abba ben Benjamin, nonetheless, the reality persists. And for those modern day people who say, nonsense, garbage, we don't believe it, well, from a religious point of view, they are contradicting and denying the words of the sages. And as they themselves said, those who contradict and deny the words of the sages are heretics. By their own confession, they've made themselves heretics, just like they condemn. But whatever. Moving right along. There are so many of these entities, they fill the air. Now notice what Abba Benjamin's emphasis is on. Thank God we don't see, because if we did, we'd go nuts. But now, the Gemara is going to teach us some other things. Abaye says, they are more numerous than us, and they stand about us, it says here, like a ditch around a mound. In other words, they have a greater population. They are completely surrounded. They're all around us. Now, how come I don't see them? Well, maybe you do and you don't know it. Question. The present population of human beings on the earth is about 7 billion. Yeah, that many. Are there more human beings on the earth? Or are there more insects? I think anybody who knows anything about science would say probably 100 times more insects than humans. Really? We could have up to like 700 billion insects in the world? Maybe so, I don't know. I've never gone to count them. But science knows that their populations in total are much more than ours. As such, these entities also are much more populous than us and seek their food sources from wherever they can take them. And the more human beings open themselves up with immoral behavior, they become sources of food, like we would look at cows for meat. Rav Huna says, each one of us has 1,000 of them to his left and 10,000 to his right. Needless to say, that's a metaphor, but what they're again trying to emphasize is they're all over. Now, I'm going to share with you my personal opinion. I remember watching a science program a long time ago, in which they were filming in some deep cave in some place. And when they played back, they saw in the film something buzzing by back and forth on the film which did not appear to the naked eye. And eventually, they slowed down the film. They were able to catch what it was. And apparently, it looked like an arrow. I believe they called it a rod that was flying around faster than what the eye could see. It almost was moving insect-like, and it filled the air. They filmed them. Go online and go look up these mysterious rods, I believe they're called. Well, I'm not one to say for sure, but that sounds like what the real form these shadim are. That they are air-based, air-structured entities. And that when they interact with us for the purpose of siphoning off our energy, they can take form and structure visible to our eye and manipulate the mind accordingly. So, apparently they're all around. Continuing, Rava says, you know that feeling of sometimes you're being squeezed? Like if you were in a public place and, you feel like you're all pressured around. You ever feel that when no one's around? That's because of them. He says here, the knees that become tired are affected due to them. Sometimes your legs start to get weak because they're all around. And he says you can feel them sometimes like a presence. How many of us have sometime felt the presence? Like right now, right over your left shoulder, you can almost feel that someone, something is there now, watching you. And if you turned real quick, you might be able to grab a glance. But by the time you turned, they're not there. But you still feel them, don't you? Now, of course, I'm trying to spook you and make you feel all kinds of weird things and the like. But many people do sense presences. And many times you're sensitive to the presence, because a lot of times these entities are, according to our sages, except the modern ones, really there. The Gemara then continues that the garments of rabbinic students wear out quickly are affected thus due to their rubbing. That these entities apparently have some kind of a physical effect. And Talmudic or rabbinic students who are really not working out in the field and wearing down their clothes, but are sitting in the yeshiva learning, these entities apparently are butting into them, rubbing into them, causing wear and tear in their garments. Why are they in the yeshiva? I thought that the light of Torah and holiness was supposed to safeguard one. Well, I guess in some ways it can, and in some ways it can't. I guess it depends on an individual's sincerity. Again, it continues and says, the feet that are knocked are affected due to them. Again, what this is saying here is any of these phenomena indicate a weakening and therefore require of us protection. And there's even a famous psalm, Psalm 91, which is said to be the anti-demonic psalm. And to this day, again, it's recited regularly. But now, you really want to get a little weird? the Gemara is going to teach us something which I'm going to take a wild guess does not come from a Jewish source. Probably was never revealed through prophecy, but does show that the holy sages of Israel had access and exposure to all the unclean and nefarious peoples around them, and observed and learned from them to recognize the nature of what they were doing, so that they would recognize it and be able to prevent people from getting involved in things which are forbidden by Torah law for us all. And the Gemara states, if a person wants to know of their presence, let him take sifted ashes and place them around his bed before going to sleep. And in the morning he will see marks in the ashes like the footprints of a rooster. Rooster, remember from King Solomon? Remember the strange type of feet these entities have? Yeah, they actually are taught that at night they will come around your bed. And if you put like dust and stuff like that, don't be spooked if you don't see strange type of footprints in that. Now please don't do this. Why? Because if and when it proves true, I don't want you calling me up in a panic, freaking out. Okay? But for those who have done this and have called me freaking out in a panic, according to them, I guess it worked. And now it says something else. If a person wants to see them, let him bring a placenta of a female cat. That's a black cat, the daughter of a black cat. It's also the firstborn cat, the daughter of a firstborn cat. Kind of sounds like the old legends of the seventh son of the seventh son kind of thing. Okay? And says, then burn the placenta in fire, grind it, and then take of the ash and fill your eyes with it, and then you will see them. Where on earth did they learn this from? Certainly not from any Jewish source, but apparently this is what the black forces, the witchcraft people were doing, and they learned that that's what they were doing so that they could defend and protect from it. And then it says here, he should place the remainder of the ash in an iron tube and seal it with an iron seal, lest the demons steal it from him. And he should also close his mouth so that he will not be harmed. In other words, don't go around bragging and advertising what you know. Even centuries later, Rabbi Yehuda the Chassid writes in his law code, the Sefer Hasidim, that when you have a house, you should always leave a crack in the window or a door open, because these entities, like we said, are airbound creatures. They pass through the windows in the house, through those cracks. And if you were to close them up, denying them access, that angers them. And apparently they have an emotional construct not too dissimilar from human beings, and they respond accordingly. Okay? And now, Rav Bivi Bar Abayas did this. He performed the above procedure. He saw them, and he was harmed thereby. So the rabbis prayed that God should have mercy, and he recovered. So, on this, I'm just going to conclude. Like we learned in the laws of the occult that deal with these entities, again from Rabbi Yehuda the Chassid, who wrote, don't mess with these things. People who do mess with these things end up getting hurt. These entities, even though they can appear like us, most are of the opinion that such appearances are to the eye. That they're not necessarily physical as some would claim, but more like visionary experiences. That tends to be not only the opinion of some of the modern rabbinic forces, but also very possible an explanation of a lot of these alien encounter and alien abduction scenarios, wherein which a person claims they're kidnapped by an alien, the alien takes them aboard the spacecraft and has sex with them. And you wake up in the morning and obviously there's no record of you ever leaving your bed at night. And when you do studies in this material, you'll find that most people say this happened through astral projection. Even though they will swear it was real, I felt it, I sensed it in every which way. And if a man has such an experience, you might find that he had a wet dream, an ejaculation in his sleep. This, psychologically, is something that we can understand. We can acknowledge and embrace. And even though psychologically they're going to debate and argue the existence of these other entities, our sages don't. Our sages acknowledge them. The story that we learned with King Solomon, whether or not it is fiction, completely or not, is irrelevant. Because it includes within it details, the likes of which we read here, Tractate Berakhot, which were firmly believed then, firmly believed throughout the centuries by many great rabbis and sages, mystics and non-mystics alike. And although Maimonides wants to dismiss the existence of these entities, his was a minority opinion of one. Frankly, it was not accepted by anybody. And rabbis both before him and after him have continued to say, look, just because you haven't had an experience, you cannot deny the experiences of everyone else. And that's just the way it is. That is why we learn about these things in our godly life course. Why the mystical Talmud teaches us these things, because we live in this world, we've got to know what it's all about. We have to learn proper morals and characters so that if and when encounters of this nature do occur, we recognize them for what they are and take the appropriate measures, safeguards, and protections to stay safe. And as I conclude, I hear the rumblings of the thunder outside my office again. So I'm going to take that as my cue to thank you all for joining me tonight. I am, of course, your host, Ariel Tzadok. You find me online at KosherTorah.com. I will see you all in our next class. Thank you all for joining me. Good night. Shalom. 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 Good night. Shalom.